I'm Louise Mackenzie. I'm the Director of Workforce at Ashford and St Peter's Hospital, which is an acute trust in Surrey. We have 5,000 staff in my organisation. It's not a particularly big organisation. In fact, some of the other kind of big London hospitals are much bigger. But what it means is you kind of see life. So we have our workforce is representative of the community with which we serve. Our demographic makeup of our workforce is similar. The kind of issues that happen to people and families, and we see that in our workforce. And so it's a really interesting place for a people expert. I mean, that's what I do, and having the ability to work with a very diverse range of people, and having an ability to use something like Lumina, where that helps me to understand a bit more about human behaviour and how people, kind of what their preferences are and how they kind of, what happens to them, in different scenarios, sort of makes my job more understandable and enables me to do it, I think, in a more constructive way. I keep using that word, but I think that when people think about HR and think about what we do, they probably wouldn't use the word constructive. And so actually having that opportunity to be able to bring a different lens that's not about this is what the policy says, or this is what the law says, or this is what we have to do, this is the rule, but having something that feels more flexible is a really important part of my toolkit. Test that we could use with recruitment. So actually this wasn't something that we were looking for in a kind of coaching or development space, but actually we wanted to find something that we could use that could give us a bit more information around candidates in terms of personal style, what they brought to a role, their kind of human interaction with one another, their interpersonal skills. And at the time we didn't really have anything that we could use, so that's sort of what got my interest in Lumina Spark. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the business that we are in is improving the health of our local population, and so having an opportunity to make sure that we are doing that. And having an opportunity to have a safe way in which you can explore what's stopping that from happening is really important. Well, there's some really good evidence that shows that teams that work well together, teams that are supported, teams that have high levels of psychological safety, where they understand one another and where they work well as a team, there's really good evidence to show that has a direct correlation to patient outcomes. So that's pretty important. That's the service that we are there to give. We are there to make people better. We are there to treat our patients, and therefore the clinical outcomes for patients drives everything that we think about strategically. So if I am looking at metrics that show a team is not healthy, that we have high levels of employee relations issues, grievances, disciplinaries, high levels of sickness, where we have turnover and our retention data is telling us that people are leaving because of their colleagues, not because of an opportunity. And we have some really good data in our staff survey that tells us a lot of the kind of cultural barometer of teams. So where you're seeing indicators that demonstrate that teams are not working well together, then you would be able to correlate that with patient outcomes. You would be able to see that either patients are not being treated in a timely way, or the clinical incidents that are happening, or the outcome for that patient in terms of the care pathway is not as good as it would have been if that team had worked in a different way. So it's hugely important that we have an opportunity to improve the health of the teams. And there's a number of ways in which you can do that, but certainly having an understanding of what makes people tick, and in particular what happens to people under pressure, is part of that. Yeah, I mean, some of it is teams that are where the dynamic is just not working, and they want it to improve. So I suppose one of the things about Lumina is that it's not an intervention that we use in a punitive way. So it's always an intervention that we use in a way to have a positive outcome and to understand and explain a little bit more. And we don't use it all the time. There are times when teams need a different intervention. So that might be mediation, and so that's a completely different skill set and something that we would do where that's required. But I think for me, there is an opportunity for us to use it to improve the performance of teams, and sometimes that's teams that are very functional but want to be better. And so again, an opportunity for us to say, how can you explore the different strengths of the team in a different way. As you say, we started with the board and with our consultant workforce, both of which are quite senior within the organisation. So the opportunity to have a conversation with a senior leader about their competencies and what they bring was sort of reasonably easy to do. They're reasonably familiar with that kind of conversation. But we wanted to also think about how we might use it with teams within the organisation and across the hierarchy of our grades. And so we found a range of opportunities with which we've been able to do that. New teams, so it's something that we encourage when we're bringing together new teams, either because they've expanded and you've grown a team and you've got lots of new members in the team, an opportunity for that team to understand what the strengths that we bring collectively, how do we behave when we are together, what happens when we're under pressure, are there any gaps in terms of our preferences, what does that look like in terms of the delivery of the work that we're trying to do. So we have used that in a really constructive way with new teams now. And in fact, we've got a session with one of my teams coming up where we will use Lumina, and it'll be the first time that they will have been familiarised with that. But we've also used it with teams who are struggling, and you will understand the NHS context, and in particular in a world where we're coming out of post-COVID, which was a real challenge, as I'm sure you can appreciate, for the NHS. But there is quite a lot of impact of that within teams. And so we've used it where, for example, we've then had to change the structure of teams and put people through a process of being redeployed into other jobs, and therefore splitting them up with team members that they might have been quite familiar, and bringing together new teams. And so we've used it in that space where teams are struggling, possibly they are feeling anxious about working with people that they don't know and that they're not familiar with and that they've not necessarily chosen to work with. So we've used it in that space. And certainly we've had some really good feedback from our nursing teams where they've been subject to quite a lot of change and, kind of closing wards and opening new wards, and we've had to split teams, which is, can be really difficult for them. So we've been able to use it as a way of working through those difficulties and getting teams to think about, how do we want to consolidate the skills that we've got? How do we want to improve our performance? How do we want to be better? And so, a number of opportunities for us to do that. And then ultimately, we have used it on a one-to-one basis. So possibly where, kind of the heart of where Lumina was developed in terms of that coaching piece. And we will use it on a one-to-one basis. Quite often we pull it together with a 360. So if somebody is looking for feedback on themselves as a leader, then we would look at multi-sources of feedback, both their own sort of perception of themselves through Lumina, but also what their colleagues are saying about them, what their peers, what the staff that work for them will say. And that gives you a great picture that can then enable a really good coaching conversation, especially if somebody is saying that they have a preference, an underlying preference, but it's really obvious that their teams are not seeing that. And so that generates a great conversation about what is it about when you're at work, why aren't you tuning that up? What can you do to tune up some of those qualities that obviously your team are looking for, because that's what they're saying in the feedback. I think for me, one of the biggest values has been the third persona. So what happens to people when they're under pressure? Because I think that that sometimes it's more difficult to recognise those traits in yourself, or it's certainly more difficult to explain maybe why they've happened. So it's a really safe explanation as to what happens to people under pressure. And I think it therefore gives you, well, it certainly has given me what I think is a much safer language with people, where you can say, let's just look at, kind of what happened last week, and, is it because this is the place that you went to, and do you recognise that in yourself, and how might you be able to, think about that, next time, and maybe think about how you might be in a different way. So I think it's in a place where, you could either have conflict in teams, or in a place where people are feeling really, really under pressure. And, we work in a service that is very unpredictable. We work with members of the public who are very unpredictable. And, that means that there are occasions where you would see both the organisation under significant pressure and stress, and people's reactions to that being maybe at the extreme of their personalities. And so having something that enables you to identify that, particularly when you've got people in conflict with one another, and maybe part of that conflict is that they go to very different places under pressure. And I had a brilliant example of two of my very close colleagues were under pressure. One of them, who was quite extroverted in style, would become more so and want to talk to people about the issues and want to be with people during that real pressure, but was working with a colleague who again was quite introverted in nature and quite reflective, and under pressure became really kind of quite acutely in that way, to the point of needing to withdraw herself in order to be able to process what was going on, maybe look at the data, maybe look at the evidence, but sort of on her own be able to think through what's my response to this crisis. And so if you're working in a very close team where one person needs to talk to you and needs to talk it through, and the other person needs to be alone, then that's quite a difficult situation. And actually what the light bulb moment was when we were able to look at their Lumina profiles, and using the app where you overlay them onto one another, that was brilliant to see what happens to people under pressure. And it enabled a conversation between the two of them as, oh, that's why you do that and that's why I do this. So just a kind of realisation of what each other needed at that time was really constructive and helpful in that relationship. Well, I think it's a really constructive conversation, because the beauty of Lumina is that it is what people are saying about themselves. So in my 9 years of using it, and I use it a lot, I have very rarely has somebody looked at the profile and gone, oh, well, that's a surprise to me. So, you know, I've had so many emails and so many phone calls with people that have gone, I've just read my report and that has completely nailed me. So there is hopefully a self-familiarity with what the Lumina is telling people. So they that's what they've said, they understand themselves. And it's an opportunity to then have a really constructive conversation, I think, in a safe way that says, well, it's clearly, you know, it's a positive attribute that you've got, but it's not coming out in how you work. So what's the opportunity for you to do that? Probably quite a similar way. I think that's the beauty of the tool, is that it's applicable across grades, across the different professional groups. It's applicable across, you know, sort of the different levels that people work in. And I think the visual nature of the tool, the fact that you can use technology, the fact that you can use, you know, cards, the fact that you can get the mat out and get people to move around, I think that appeals to all types of teams. So I think that's part of the beauty of Lumina for me, is that it doesn't feel like you have to do it in a different way depending on the audience. And I'm obviously qualified, and I've supported a number of my colleagues to become qualified as Lumina practitioners. And it's not a space that we are expert in at all. And so having almost a community of practice within the organisation that are able to use the Lumina tool is really important for us as well. So we quite often, you know, if somebody's one of my team is running a session next week, and they wanted to talk through what approach people had used. So we shared they hadn't ever physically used the mat before. They'd only done it they'd only really used the tool on a one-to-one basis. So, you know, we gave them some tips about how they might be able to do that in a different way. So I think that, you know, that's been really important, that we've been able to train a number of colleagues and then think about, you know, kind of what that means in terms of their confidence to do interventions with one-to-ones and with teams. Yeah, I think the teams where people are struggling, we'd probably spend more time on a one-to-one basis with them beforehand. So I think there's more of an opportunity to do something that gets people to be more personally aware of their strengths and gaps, and then bringing them together in a way that then feels like the conversation is on the same page at that point. So you're kind of they've got an opportunity to be able to bring to the conversation something about their style, about their strengths, that maybe if you hadn't have had that time to do on a one-to-one basis, then the conversation might be difficult and the conflict may continue. So I think the difference is that we would probably try to spend a bit more time on a one-to-one basis, getting people into a more positive mindset and having a better understanding of themselves, so that they could then think about, well, what does that mean for the team? No, definitely. And so if you take that last piece around being collaborative, then there's a bit about, you know, if you have a team that wants to be better, then there is a part that we are teaching about how do you use tools and techniques in order to be able to work across organisations, which is a different skill set to being able to work, you know, just within your own hierarchy. So that kind of matrix management approach is really important. But I'd say for a lot of people, coming together as teams in whatever shape or form, they will go back to those values, and it'll be we have our values behaviour matrix. So what are the values that we expect, and what are the behaviours that we don't expect with those values. So yeah, I'd say that that's a fairly strong anchor. Gosh, that's a difficult question, really. We have probably many cultures in the organisation. I think one of the underlying so we've got some really strong values that underpin how we work, and staff really enjoy going back to those core values and understanding them, and those values around people first, personal responsibility, passion for excellence, and pride in our team. And so that sort of is a really good anchor with which people can think about what their contribution is to the organisation through that lens. We're a very friendly organisation, which is something that people say all the time. So, we have quite a lot of people that leave and then come back, and and we call it the boomerang effect. They kind of feel like they want to go and explore what life is like elsewhere, but they ultimately will come back and they'll comment on a number of things, one of which is the friendly, almost family nature of the relationships. So that seems really important. I'd say we're quite a humble organisation, and that sometimes is to our detriment. So we don't talk ourselves up a lot. We tend to be quite critical. So we're quite observational about the things that we're not good at, as opposed to talking about the things that we're good at. So we try, there's a dynamic there that we're trying to influence. And I suppose the final bit is we're quite a collaborative organisation, so we spend a lot of time talking to people outside of the immediate hospital that have an impact on us being able to do our business. So, we're only as good as the community services and the primary care services and the other kind of infrastructure around us.